Good evening, everyone. My name is Beatrice Burak. I'm a senior from Hopkinton, New Hampshire, studying history and government, and I work as a student assistant with the Rockefeller Center's public programs. It's my pleasure to welcome both our in-person and virtual audiences to this program. We appreciate you joining us today, and in just a few minutes, we will welcome our guest speaker, Congressman Seth Moulton, and our moderator, Professor Muirhead, to the stage for a very timely conversation about the Democratic Party, Congress, and Congressman Moulton's focal issues as a member of Congress. We will make sure there's time for audience Q&A, and we will prioritize student questions. So when we get to that part of the program, please just raise your hand, and we will try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. We do ask that you wait for the microphone to begin asking your question so that both our in-person and our virtual audiences can hear you. And as a reminder, Dartmouth is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. With that, we would ask that you do not interfere or disrupt today's program, which would include preventing attendees from seeing or hearing our guest and our moderator, or interfering with our guest and moderator's ability to speak and be heard. Moderating tonight's conversation is Professor Muirhead, who teaches political philosophy in the government department here at Dartmouth, and where he is the Robert Clements Professor of Democracy and Politics. He is the author with Nancy Rosenblum of 2 books on contemporary American democracy: Ungoverning, The Attack on the Administrative State and the Politics of Chaos, which is published by Princeton University last year, and A Lot of People Are Saying, The New Conspiracism and the Attack on Democracy, published by Princeton in 2019. Professor Muirhead also serves in the New Hampshire House of Representatives, where he focuses on election law, very timely topic here in New Hampshire. We are honored to also have Congressman Seth Moulton joining us in conversation today. Congressman Moulton joined the Marines in 2001, just days after his college graduation, and a few months before the attacks on 9/11. He led a frontline infantry platoon in the 1st Marine Company to enter Baghdad, and he later worked to establish a free and independent Iraqi media, and served as a liaison to senior Iraqi military and political leaders for General Petraeus. While he was an outspoken critic of the Iraq War, he proudly served 4 tours because he didn't want anyone to go in his place. After returning home from Iraq, Congressman Moulton used the GI Bill to earn joint degrees in business and public administration, and then became the managing director of Texas Central, where he worked to build America's first high-speed rail line. In his run to represent Massachusetts' 6th District in the United States Congress, Congressman Moulton challenged the establishment with a platform focused on bringing a new generation of leadership to Washington and fighting for progressive values while reaching across the aisle to get things done. In 2018, Congressman Moulton won a Democracy Award for Transparency. In 2020, he won another such award for his constituent services. And in 2022, he was awarded for his achievement in innovation and modernization. Congressman Moulton's legislation created the 988 National Suicide Lifeline, which is now live in all 50 states. He's delivered faster care for veterans, modernized government travel, and delivered on ALS disability insurance. His American High-Speed Rail Act is one of the most ambitious and forward-thinking infrastructure packages before Congress today. And his GI Bill Restoration Act would finally restore long-denied benefits to Black veterans of World War II. Today, Congressman Moulton sits on 3 committees. He's member of the House Armed Services Committee, where he served as ranking member on the Subcommittee on Strategic Forces. At the beginning of the 118th Congress, he was selected by party leadership to sit on the new Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the US and China, which was created to shape a diplomatic, economic, and military strategy toward the Chinese Communist Party that preserves American leadership and avoids war. In Massachusetts, Congressman Moulton works to support small local businesses and veterans, advance civil rights, and grow the economy. He created a model intergovernmental task force that has spurred over $1 billion in federal economic development and funding for the city of Lynn, and he forged a unique partnership between fishermen and scientists to ensure the long-term sustainability of fish stocks and the local fishing economy. Congressman Moulton is also the proud father of 2 girls, Emmy and Caroline. His wife, Liz, is a sports industry executive, and they live in Salem, Massachusetts. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Moulton and Professor Muirhead to the stage.
Congressman, thank you. Thank you for trekking up here in the depth of winter, for the coldest winds of the winter so far. I am, really delighted and honored to be sitting here with you. It's really generous of you to come up and hang with us today.
No, Russ, thank you. I had the honor of speaking to a couple classes and hearing from some of your students, and I always find that students ask some of the best, most thoughtful, and most creative questions, often the most intellectually challenging. So I love spending time in places like this, and I think it's important, especially at a time when a lot of people are losing faith in democracy, for people like me to come and spend time with the next generation of leaders who hopefully are going to fix it. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, I got to say, looking, taking in your example, someone who's been a Marine and serving in Congress, it is, to me, an inspiring example, and I think it'll be inspiring to students too. So, I would say thank you for your service, and thank you for your service in Congress. And speaking of that, I'm really curious, what is it like to be a member of Congress right now? What's it like to be a Democrat in these dark days for Democrats? What do you all do, you Democrats in Congress, and what's it like?
Well, it's not great. It's not exactly our high point. I think it's important to say up front that my view is that we've lost really badly. And that's not held by everyone. You'll hear a lot of Democrats right now say, oh, come on, the election wasn't that bad. Statistically, it was very close, smallest popular vote margin since the 1970s. But when's the last time that our party ran against an indicted felon for president? When's the last time that we faced a party that's in total disarray? A lot of Republicans hate Trump. There's a whole other section who just see him as a vehicle, for their goals, but still don't really like him, and yet we lost. I mean, we should have cleaned up from school board to president of the United States. It should have been the easiest election in our lifetimes. So I think Democrats really do need to look ourselves in the mirror right now and say, what are we doing wrong that by definition we have lost touch with the majority of Americans? So one of the things that's happening behind the scenes is there are people like me really pushing us to change. Now, there's resistance to that, as you might imagine in any sort of bureaucracy. I could say stodgy old institution, but there's resistance to that change. A lot of the people saying, oh, we really just barely lost, are the people who have positions of power, really like the status quo and don't want to make any changes. There's also a vigorous debate about what that change looks like. There are people who honestly believe the party needs to be more progressive, more to the left, and that's going to energize the base and solve our problems in the future. There's not a lot of data to support that view. I think that we have a huge opportunity to actually bring in a bunch of disaffected Republicans and independents who I heard a lot of them say to me in the lead up to the election, I really don't like this guy. I know he's a nutcase, but God, you Democrats are just so out of touch. So let's get back in touch with Americans. Let's do more listening to voters instead of preaching down on them, down to them, sort of saying, Russ, if you disagree with me, if you vote for Trump, then you're not only wrong, you're a bad person.
Yeah.
You hear a lot of that.
Yeah.
But that debate is going on behind the scenes. And then, of course, we also have to figure out how to respond to Trump. And honestly, there's a lot of stuff we did the first term that didn't work out that well. And I think that's part of why you don't see marching in the streets and things like that at the moment. But we are absolutely still trying to figure out our strategy going forward. So it's a time of a bit of chaos, a bit of sorrow, and frustration right now, I think, in the party. That's the honest assessment.
And on the two big, domestic policies that kind of define Trump, immigration or border control and tariffs, I have trouble putting my finger on the Democratic alternative. I mean, are we for?
Absolutely.
What are we for?
This is a huge part of the problem.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've said is that in our strategy to respond to Trump, we have to have an alternative. We have to say what we would do instead, especially because so many Americans agree with the fundamental need to address these problems. They may not like how he's doing it, although 53% of Americans right now approve of what Donald Trump is doing. That's more than voted for him. right? So, like, we can shake our heads at that if you don't support him. But the reality is that people are saying, well, at least he's doing something about immigration, and he's living up to his campaign promise to do so. At least he's doing something about cutting the federal government. At least he's doing something about our commitments overseas. I mean, in every one of those issues, I can give you a lot of reasons why the way he's approaching it is going to be bad for us in the long term. Bad for our national security, bad for the rule of law, bad for the simple responsibility of following the Constitution. But if Democrats don't have an alternative, that's a real problem.
And when you think about what the alternative, or what's at the heart of the alternative, what are you thinking it ought to be? I sometimes think, and I hate to confess this as a professor, but I don't have all the answers. But I pretend I do during class. But I sometimes think, well, the Democratic Party should be the party of governing, not so much government, but governing well. Governing with integrity, governing effectively. We believe that government is necessary and that it has a proper role and that it can improve the lives of ordinary people. We're not the ones, like, no Democrat's going to get up and say, government's not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. They think kind of the reverse. Actually, government is the solution to lots of problems, whether it's pollution or whatever. But when I was running an uncontested race for a very, very low level position, probably the lowest
very important position
in the entire country, but one we care about, I wanted to point my finger to some of the successes. There was a $1.9 trillion American Rescue Act. I wanted to point to stuff that did. I wanted to point to stuff that the infrastructure bill did. Another $1 trillion passed in the same year, 2021. And take like broadband, which was in the infrastructure bill. New Hampshire kind of got its $200 million allocation, but there isn't a single house in the state that's been wired up because of that. I mean, nothing has been done in a sense. It's just been process. Right. So I don't even know if like, is that where we should stand, governing well? And if so, can we govern well?
Well, I mean, look, the federal government built the Transcontinental Railroad. The federal government built the Hoover Dam. The federal government put the first man on the moon. The federal government built the internet with a little help from Al Gore. So the federal government has done great things in the past, but how many of you would say that today, in 2025, the federal government is a model for efficiency and effectiveness? Well, there are quite a few Democrats in the room, I can tell from some of the nodding heads to earlier comments, and yet even Democrats don't look at the federal government and say that's a model. So it's a real problem for Democrats if we're the model, if we are the party of government, and the federal government really needs reform, and we have no plan to do so. It's a real problem for Democrats if we think there are problems. We have issues. We want to be the model of governing, as you said, but you look to big blue cities, and they have a lot of problems. That doesn't say to Americans, oh, we should put these Democrats in charge of the whole country, because crime and education in Chicago are really great.
Yeah, I think Peggy Noonan said in a recent column, Democrats just run one great city well. And use that as an example. I think she's sort of desperate for the Democrats to succeed in a way. And
I actually would argue that Boston's doing pretty well, but
I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that.
But not on everything.
Yeah.
Boston's actually doing really well on crime. Boston is doing really well on higher education. We'll leave elementary education aside for a second. We got a lot of work to do there. Boston has huge problems with transportation. We do have some things we need to work on. But there's no question across the board, Chicago, San Francisco. I mean, we know that there are big problems in these cities run by Democrats. We know that there are big problems with the federal government, which we claim to support. So we've got to do better.
How about housing? I mean, that seems to be like when, obviously another story about the election of 2024 was, not that it was, social issues, not that it was immigration, it was inflation or price levels. And the place where I've seen people hurt the most by inflation is rents. Yes, eggs and meat, protein of all sorts, but rent is the one that really crushes you because that's such a big part of the household budget. And when rents go up by 40%, in 2 or 3 or 4 years, that's just devastating to people's well-being. Ultimately, from the couple weeks that I paid attention in intro to econ, if you want prices to go down, you got to get supply to go up. We got to build housing. I've read on the upper, level kind of estimates that we need maybe like 30 million units of housing. Or is there something distinctive that Democrats can say about that problem, about housing, that we might be able to use the government to do?
Yeah, so actually I came back from the Munich Security Conference just the day before yesterday. And if you've watched the news in the last 48 hours, this is big news. It was important to be there. Because of the counterintelligence threat, I couldn't use my laptop when I was there. And so when I connected through Frankfurt for the flight home, I opened my laptop, took it out of this bag, and loaded like 50 articles to read on my long flight back to Boston. And then just before we took off, the House of Representatives with their IT people forced my laptop to restart, and I lost everything. Just at the same time as I got a message from AT&T that I'd used all my hotspot data. And that was a moment where I was swearing to myself about the federal government. Why can't we get this to work? So just to reinforce the point that we need to have a more efficient government. As a result, I took out an old-fashioned paper magazine and read an article in The Atlantic about how liberals are responsible for our housing problems, because liberals have really forced zoning restrictions, at least in the last 30 or 40 years. I think there's a really good argument that a lot of the whole concept of zoning was put in place about 100 years ago with a lot of racial implications, or motivations, I should say. But in the last 30 or 40 years, it's been liberals who don't want their communities to change, who put a historic preservation on every marker on every lamppost, that have prevented people from building houses where we need it most. So actually, we need to do some looking in the mirror when it comes to housing policy. I'm also someone who, because I sit on the transportation committee, who's very attuned to transportation issues. And housing policy would also be a lot better if we had better transportation, specifically if you could just get to where the jobs are from places that are affordable to live. So to bring this home to where we live in New England, a lot of jobs are in Boston, specifically around the South Boston seaport. I live in Salem, which is 15 miles from Boston. It takes an hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours to get to the Boston seaport, 15 miles away at rush hour. That's insane. And by the way, you don't solve that by building more highways. You just need to have trains like the rest of the world. And if we had high-speed rail, you'd be able to get from here to Boston in under an hour. That would be pretty transformative, right? I mean, it'd be nice to have the option to at least have a job in Boston or commute there or go there for dinner. You don't have that today, and yet in most of the world, we do. If you had high-speed rail to Western Massachusetts, you could get from Springfield to Boston in 45 minutes. Imagine what that would do for the economy in Springfield. Imagine what it would do for housing access for everyone who wants to work in Boston. So there's also a real nexus with transportation. But again, back to the federal government, we can't seem to build anything in America. And why is that? Well, many would argue because of liberal policy that's forced so many environmental and other sort of restrictions on things that you can't build anything without going through years of approvals and delays and everything else. I actually ran a high-speed rail project in Texas for a while. I'm sorry to admit that that line has yet to be completed. And our biggest obstacle was environmental reviews, which is pretty extraordinary when high-speed rail is so fundamentally good for the environment, so much better for the environment than the alternatives, flying or driving.
Yeah.
And yet it's environmental reviews that hold us back. So I think there are a lot of places where we have to honestly say to ourselves, where can we do better? Now, look, there are a lot of problems with transportation policy when it comes to Republicans as well, who basically just want to subsidize driving and nothing else. So I'm not exonerating the other party. But as we're sitting here complaining about problems, there are a lot of fixes that are our responsibility.
Yeah, a shared responsibility. I've seen on zoning, I've seen a lot of Republicans in the New Hampshire legislature vote against, efforts to make it easier for people to install, accessory dwelling units and stuff like that. It's not just liberals.
It's not just, that's a very good point. Look, what I'm driving at, and I certainly, I don't think you'll see anywhere in my record that I'm defending Trump or the Republicans, but what I'm driving at is it's not enough just to blame the other side. You got to have a plan yourselves.
Yeah.
And you got to be willing to show that we are willing to change to make things better for Americans. or they're just going to continue to dismiss us.
Yeah, I got to say, I really resonate with that. I mean, I really resonate. I mean, that's what, I want to, as a partisan, I mean, as a citizen and as a teacher, I'm interested in the arguments and in the discussions and in both sides. But as a partisan, when I'm in a campaign or running or something, I want to be in a party that's saying more than we're not him. That really stands for something inspiring and comprehensive and real.
One of the, I think a lot about leadership because of my time in the Marines, an organization that very consciously teaches leadership. And one of my favorite leadership stories is from John F. Kennedy. And it's about going to the moon. But it's not what most people think about when they consider his leadership about going to the moon. They think about the speech, right? He gave a great speech. He was good at giving great speeches. I wish I were that good. That's inspiring. But leadership is actually about really making things happen. And this could be somewhat apocryphal, but my understanding is that after he gave that speech, he said, let's make sure that NASA can actually get us to the moon by the end of the decade. And he assigned some deputies to go dive into NASA, and they came back and reported, nope, they cannot do it. And then John F. Kennedy said, we need to change things. And he had on-the-ground leadership experience in the Navy. And he made reforms to fix that federal agency so that it could succeed in that mission. That's the kind of leadership that we need right now to fix our government and to show that we can do great things again.
It sometimes seems to just reading the paper right now that the ethos of the Trump administration, to turn to Trump, and is not making things work. It's about breaking things, and it's almost a kind of zeal to break stuff, like USAID. I don't know what was so offensive about treating the poorest people in the world with medicines that they desperately needed, but just to kind of make an exhibit of destroying that to show that he could do it seemed like the idea. And
well, let me just be clear that what they're doing to USAID, just to pick one example, and probably like the worst example for us to choose because there are a lot of Americans who don't understand the role of USAID, so it's probably not where we politically should put our flag in the ground. But what they're doing to USAID will not only result in a lot of kids dying across the world, but it will put American troops at risk. Because I can tell you, we relied on USAID when I was on the ground in Iraq. USAID saved a lot of American lives in places like that. So what they're doing is unbelievably dangerous for national security. And you're right, they're destroying it. But again, we can't just say, no, bad. We've got to say, here's how we would reform it to make it better.
So you're just back from Munich. I mean, amazing. You were there.
I was in the room for the vice president's infamous speech.
You were? Wow.
It was really a lecture, not a speech, but.
For the lecture. What's your take on Trump's foreign policy? It gets less attention, I think, than many aspects of his domestic policy, and the campaign didn't focus on foreign policy that much.
Yeah, so I actually think that the foreign policy implications of the Trump presidency are the most dangerous. And that's a contrarian view. I'll be clear in saying that because he's obviously challenging the Constitution, the rule of law, basic institutions like the functioning of Congress. I mean, these are very serious domestic issues. But in terms of real existential threats, I mean, the biggest threat we face in the entire world today is a war with China. I mean, that could literally be World War III, go nuclear, and end 3/4 of life on Earth. That's a strong statement. But when you sit in the rooms that I do and look at the classified intelligence, I'm telling you, you'd probably agree with me. And Trump is very weak on China. Trump is very weak on Russia. Trump is dangerous for our national security because contrary to the view that he likes to project, he's viewed as very weak by our adversaries and therefore is bad for deterrence, bad for the fundamental job of the US military to deter and prevent wars from happening. And that showed through in Munich. And all our allies sat down with us after that abominable speech and were really shaken because they questioned whether we would be with them to prevent another war in Europe. They questioned our commitment to preventing wars in Asia. They fundamentally questioned whether we were invested in the rest of the world at all. And I think part of the philosophical reason why Trump is so weak on national security is because he and Musk's view of the world, and this is important too because Musk is his partner in the presidency, they really view the world as spheres of influence, one in Europe, where Russia gets a big say, one in Asia, where China gets a big say and we don't need to get involved, and then one over here in the Americas, where we should be focused on things like renaming the Gulf of Mexico. But that's not a joke. I think that's really their philosophy. And the implications of this, I think, are very dangerous for national security and for just our own safety here at home.
When you hear things like, Canada should be a state, or we should take over Greenland, I mean, do you just classify that as, absurd stuff that's not worth paying attention to? Or is that, a window into the foreign policy of this administration?
Well, here's the problem. He said sort of three major controversial things within days of getting elected on foreign policy. I mean, trust me, there's a long list of other controversial things he said. But taking over Canada, taking over Greenland, and taking over the Panama Canal, right? And I don't understand the argument for taking over Canada. I mean, even if let's be charitable for a second and try to understand what he's talking about. Don't understand that at all. Greenland actually is important for our national security. It really does have some national security implications. That by no means is a reason to take it over. Panama actually, I think, is a more significant problem. So one out of the three is like, yeah, we really should do something about that. And so there are a lot of places where his ideas have a tiny dose of reality that makes people say, well, I don't really know. Is he serious? Maybe there's some thoughtful things we should do here. And it's therefore hard to know which should just be completely dismissed out of hand because you don't know how seriously he's going to pursue any of them. He's not a very serious person, and he's certainly not very serious when it comes to national security. And there will be a big debate within the administration between people like Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio, who have relatively mainstream views but are totally cowed by Trump, and then the whole Steve Bannon crowd, who, are on a different planet.
Will Hegseth be able to manage?
Stay sober? Look, I went to grad school with him. He scrubbed that from his resume, by the way. He doesn't want to put Harvard Kennedy School on his resume. But I certainly don't know him well. But I think he's unquestionably the least qualified Secretary of Defense that we've ever had. And this is a very dangerous time for that. So he's learning on the job. He went to Princeton, so I mean, he was able to get himself into school. He's not an idiot, but he's completely unprepared for this position. And from a leadership perspective, he has spent the last 10 or 15 years literally working to politicize the military. That's been his shtick. That's not good for our troops. That's not good for our national security.
And when you say politicize the military, you mean purge the military of generals who aren't loyal to the leaders of the Republican Party?
I think there are a lot of different manifestations of this. But just when he was a talking head at Fox News, he was always trying to inject politics into military policy. I mean, that's one of the ironies, right, is the Republicans have accused Democrats of being the ones who put politics into the military, like DEI initiatives. By the way, there's some truth to that. There are some places in the Department of Defense where DEI went too far and impacted military effectiveness and readiness. But there are far more places where having Republicans come in and ban books, say you can't study certain texts if you go to West Point, say that you're not allowed to do certain things that might be good for diversity in your unit, saying that recruiters can't talk about how the military is accepting of people from all different walks of life, which by the way, is, if you look at recruiting surveys, one of literally the number one reason why people won't join, because people think they might not be accepted into the military. So there are a lot of ways in which it's really the Republicans who are politicizing the military, but they've used this argument to cast that blame on Democrats, and Pete Hegseth has been the biggest champion of that point of view.
How do you think, what is the most effective way for the opposition party in the United States now to oppose. So whether it's on foreign policy or domestic policy, I mean, we don't really have a leader of the party, and yet, you know, there are hundreds of high-ranking Democrats. So how do we oppose? Should we have a midterm convention in 2026?
Well, I think there's a few, look, admitting where we began, which is that the Democratic Party has a lot of work to do and we don't have a fantastic strategy right now. I think there are a few things that we can do. First of all, we have got to show that we are open to reform and demonstrate very publicly that we are going to do different things differently as a party. That means less preaching and more listening. It means putting people in positions of leadership who aren't just from the most liberal, safest districts in the entire country, and therefore have no idea how to communicate with people in the middle or across the aisle. It means actually being willing to have debates about contentious issues, which is something that I've put out there that we can't do. There are some issues that are just off limits to Democrats because we don't want to offend anyone in our interest groups. And that leads a lot of Americans to believe that we're really out of touch. So I think, first of all, we need to show America, we hear you, we're going to change. We're going to do things differently. Second of all, we need to show that we can lead, that we have an alternative, that we're no longer going to sit back and just say, yeah, the federal government's fine, or there's not a problem at the southern border, or inflation, yeah, it's just transitory. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about those egg prices. It's just transitory. Remember when the Biden administration was saying that?
I do.
I mean, what the hell does that even mean? Well, you probably know what it means because you go to Dartmouth, but that's a problem. And it just shows that we're really, really out of touch.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to responding to Trump, we do have to be, and this is painful because all of the stuff they're doing is really hard, but we have to be strategic about how we respond because we control nothing in Washington. So we can't just vote it all down. We can't just veto it somehow. We've actually got to really pick and choose our battles so that we put ourselves in a position to win in 2 years. And then if we can win the midterms and just take back the House, even if we just take back the House, that'll put us in a very different position. But I'm concerned right now that we haven't embraced the fact that we need to change, that we need to do things differently if we're going to win. And therefore, it's not a sure thing that we're going to win back the House in 2026.
Yeah. Let me invite people to ask questions of Congressman Moulton. And if you have a question, signal. Somebody, one of the volunteers here from the Rockefeller Center will come by with a microphone. I see your hand, and they'll see it too, so you'll get a microphone soon.
And by the way, I'll encourage you, you can really ask difficult questions. You know, don't be shy. Ask whatever you'd like.
Hi, thank you so much for visiting.
for
I
having
was
me.
really struck by you saying that Trump was a weak leader with China and Russia, because I was recalling that a lot of the Democratic rhetoric around Trump before he was elected and afterwards is that he's too strong, he's too powerful, he's fascist, he's a dictator, and all of this really fed into this impression of him that both the Republicans and the Democrats seem to agree on, which is that he was essentially too powerful a leader. And I was wondering whether you would think of that as having contributed to the Democratic loss, like whether Democrats should have taken a different position that was also acknowledged the ways in which Trump was a weak leader, because I just feel like we've never heard anything like that about Trump as a person and as a personality.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and there is this perception that he's just strong, right? And I think it's very important for Democrats to point out ways in which he's weak, but he's especially weak when it comes to national security. And Americans know that there are serious threats to our national security. They know that it's not good that Russia thinks they can just take over Europe. And so we need to really point out where Trump is weak. But I think more specifically, we need to point out where Trump is hypocritical. One of the biggest mistakes I think we've made all along is campaigning on this idea that Trump is a bad person. Because guess what? People have figured that out, all right? There are not a lot of Republicans. There are some, but there are not a lot of Republicans who really think this is a stand-up guy. You know, this is the person that God, if he could be the godfather to my next child, I'd pick Donald Trump, all right? They have made this bargain where they've just said, I know he's a bad guy. I know he doesn't share my values. But he's going to get me what I want, whether it's lower taxes or maybe actually some strongly held beliefs like he's gonna, he's gonna get my position accomplished on abortion or something like that, right? So it's not effective for Democrats to go around, moralizing and say, oh, you shouldn't vote for him because he's a bad person, in case you haven't figured that out. Likewise, right now, I don't think we should be so focused on the outrage at what he's doing. Because guess what? People elected him, a majority of Americans elected him to do what he's doing. So let's actually focus on the places where he's not delivering. Let's talk about the fact that he said inflation would go down. It's going up. Let's talk about the fact that he said the war in Ukraine would end on day one. Well, that clearly hasn't happened. Let's talk about the places where he's just not fulfilling his promises. I think that's a much more effective strategy than the outrage that you see today. Great question.
We have a couple more questions up front here and on this side too. Madison, if you could keep me apprised of the time, because there's no clock, and the congressman and I think could go on forever. So just keep me posted.
This thing on. I'm a proud constituent of yours from the 6th District and voted for you 4 times. I'm not a bedrock Democrat, and the reason I voted for you is because I think you're a common sense person, and I'm continually surprised that puts you at odds with Democratic Party leadership. I'm curious about how you have in the past and are currently negotiating that, because for my money, they should be psyched to have a Seth Moulton who is talking about these things that they're not talking about. They have enough problems fighting Republicans that they shouldn't be quarreling with common sense Democrats.
Well, some of them privately are, first of all, and thank you for the question from Reading.
And for the 4 votes.
What's that?
And for the 4 votes. Not on the same election.
Yeah. Look, so I wrote this op-ed in the Washington Post that has resonated quite a bit at the end of November, talking about my own experience with Democratic Party backlash and what I think should be a good direction forward. It was syndicated by other newspapers, and it's really resonated with a lot of people. Like, maybe this is one of the core problems that we have. And so I've had countless colleagues come up to me, including people from very, very liberal parts of the Democratic political spectrum, say to me, hey, Seth, you're really right on. Your op-ed is great. We need to talk about this more. And every single one of them says that to me in a whisper, because they don't want anyone else to hear, for fear that the Democrat sitting next to them might disagree. So the definition of political courage is standing up to your own party, not the other party. Every example in profiles of courage is a senator who stood up to his own party. So first of all, I just think it's important. I think people want to see political courage right now, and I just have this, I don't know, maybe old-fashioned view that I want to be able to go to sleep every night and believe that I did the right thing. I know I'm not perfect. I know I'm not always going to get things perfectly, but I don't want to do something that I know is wrong. Take a vote that I know is a political vote and not the principled thing to do. So that might be anachronistic, but my view is that at the end of the day, it serves you well to just be honest and be authentic. And that's what I try to do. And it means that some days are difficult because it's not fun to have your friends against you. But at a time when I think a lot of people recognize we need to make some changes to the party, it's not a bad place to be saying, let's actually make those changes. Does that answer your question? Okay. And I work for you, so if you need any help with anything, you let me know.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name's Sam. I'm from Massachusetts, not your district, but
Nice
still
to meet you,
proud to
Sam.
have you here. I'm one of the co-presidents of Dartmouth Democrats Club and also a graduating senior. And I guess my question would be, I feel like I've heard from members of our club and also fellow seniors who are soon to graduate some discouragement about joining the government or trying to figure out the best way to fight back against the things we're seeing in the most effective way. And I guess I was just wondering if you could give some advice to students here who are passionate about trying to fight back against some of the things we're frustrated with seeing in the government, and graduating seniors, the best way to kind of put that action towards meaningful purpose? Thank you.
It's a great question, and it's something I've thought about a lot, even just for myself, because I get questions from friends all the time along the lines of, Seth, why do you keep doing this? Like, why do you put up with this stuff? Whether it's the craziness from the current administration or the criticism from your own party, whatever it is, why do you keep doing this? Well, let me tell you a quick story. So I think my single best legislative accomplishment is 988, the new National Mental Health Hotline. And since we put this hotline into place, and if you or a loved one wakes up in the middle of the night and you have a mental health crisis, you just dial 988. The same way if you wake up in the middle of the night and your house is burning down, you don't need to look up the number for the fire department, you just dial 911. Well, it's been very effective. Since we put this law into place, calls are up 50% over the previous hotlines. But texts are up 1,450%. And since texts, of course, tend to be younger Americans, it's an amazing measurement of how many younger Americans are getting help through 988. It's literally saving thousands of lives every month, since about every call, somewhere around 90% of calls resulting in a life-saving intervention. So this has been incredibly impactful, especially for young Americans. And so I was speaking to a group of middle schoolers on the Capitol steps one day, and I shared the same statistics with them that I just shared with you. But the middle schoolers were not very impressed by these statistics. I don't think that's maybe the best way to talk to middle schoolers. But I wanted to show them that this work that I'm doing actually has an impact on their lives. But after I took the picture with them, a woman came up and said to me, Sir, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to tell you that your law saved my daughter's life. And then she introduced me to her 13-year-old daughter. That's why I keep doing this job, because it's the second job I've had in my life where my work impacts the lives of other people every single day. And the first job, the best job I've ever had, was being a Marine platoon commander. Because every single day in Iraq, even in the midst of a war that I disagreed with, my work impacted the lives of other people every day. And I realized I would much rather be there on the ground, in a place, in a position to influence the war, rather than just back here complaining about it. So my plea to you, as a graduating senior, and your friends and colleagues, is if you think our government is great and perfect and there's nothing you have to add, then fine, go to Wall Street. But if you think we can do better, then consider being a part of fixing it. Consider being a part of joining the federal government, of working in a congressional office, maybe running for office at the state or local level right away, or running for Congress in the future. Consider signing up for the Peace Corps or the military if you think our foreign policy could be better overseas. Be a part of changing our country and making it better. And I know that you've got a lot. You'll get offers from investment banks and consulting firms, and maybe you want to go to law school and be a lawyer. Lots of places where you can give other people advice. Get out there and do it, because we need young people like you, especially people talented enough to have gone to a school like this, to be a part of making our government better.
It's refreshing to hear that, and seems like such an important counter note in this moment when civil servants in particular are being disdained, condemned, and encouraged to quit regardless of what they do, regardless of their job. We just don't want you. And the whole idea of government service, in a sense.
It's a tough time, and I get the frustration. But part of that ethos for me comes from a great mentor I had in college, Peter Gomes. We were talking about him, Russ, before I came out, who just talked about the importance of service, especially if you've had the privilege of going to a place like this. Do something to give back. But it also comes from the experience I had in the Marines, where Marines run towards the fight. They don't run away from it. And I think we need people in America right now who are willing to stand up and run towards the fight. and that includes your generation.
Yeah, most of all. When I hear about this great program, Resource 988, and behind the resource is a program. I'm thinking, wow, that must cost a lot of money. If every time someone texts or calls, there's someone else there. There's some very trained people on the other end of these texts and on the other end of the line, and that makes me think about just the budget and the federal budget and the way in which my side, which believes in government, wants the government to solve problems it hasn't been solving in the past. In a sense, we do want to spend more. The other side wants to cut taxes at every chance, and there's going to be, the majority party in Congress is going to have to balance making the government work with the tax cuts that they're sort of addicted to. What do you see coming up in the budget fight? How do you see it playing out? Is the Republican majority going to be able to pass a budget?
Look, I mean, I don't mean to pile on to the cynicism here, but what do I see coming up in the budget fight? A lot of hypocrisy, because they're going to use funny math to try to make this all work. Because you're right, Trump wants to spend a lot more on things. He wants to raise spending dramatically. In fact, if back in the election when we were comparing the two candidates, I think that both Harris and Trump would have raised the deficit, Trump by about 3 times as much. And at the same time, Republicans want to cut taxes. So this is a crazy strategy from a basic fiscal standpoint. Like you can't do this for your home budget, all right? You can't do this if you're running a business. And yet that's what the Republicans want to do with our government. So you're going to see a lot of hypocrisy. You're going to see a lot of, like I say, funny math to try to justify how they can all make this work. And Democrats have to step in and use what little leverage we have, because they're probably going to need some of our votes to just get over the hump with the threat of a shutdown or whatnot, because they can't control their own extremists. We need to use that leverage that we have to try to extract something. And we'll talk about that negotiation, or we can talk about what that is, but that's basically what you're going to see coming. And there's a lot of talk behind the scenes right now among Democrats as to how we should actually use that leverage, or what we should try to get. Let me also take the opportunity to say this real quick, Russ. That everyone likes 988. How can you not like it? But everyone also says, well, Seth, that's such an obvious idea. That must have been the easiest bill to pass in the world. And it was actually really difficult to pass. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It was only because I had an amazing partner across the aisle, a fellow veteran, a Republican from Utah, who was willing to withstand a lot of criticism from the right, by working on mental health. But it was also because we had to work through a lot of tough issues, including how it was to be funded. And unsurprisingly, Democrats basically wanted it funded by the federal government. Republicans wanted to rely more on states. One of the reasons it works so well is because the people who answer the phone are very well trained, but many of them are volunteers.
I'm coming out of this conversation, really moved by your devotion to service, and also by your ability to believe in serving in Congress, even in these days, even in these dark days for people in your party, and really days in this country that are very, very contentious, where politics is a lot more about enmity than it is about cooperation. And so just as we close here, I wanted to invite you to maybe say a little bit about how you do get along with people. You just mentioned cooperating with somebody on the other side. How do you get along with Republicans? How do you talk? And do you talk? Do you hang? Do you enjoy their company? Do Democrats and Republicans look at each other with respect and goodwill these days? And how do you do it?
Yeah, this is a question I got when I first ran, because I ran on this platform of bipartisanship. I was a very rare political candidate who ran against a longtime incumbent in a primary by actually running to the center. Usually you win primaries by running to one extreme or the other. My argument was, this guy's been in office for 9 terms, he's only passed 1 bill, and it's because he's too partisan, he's too extreme. That's why he can't get things done. And people would ask me, like, how are you going to work with someone like Ted Cruz? And it's very simple. I've never worked with Ted Cruz on anything. So you have to pick the Republicans you're willing to work with. And it becomes more challenging as more of them lose. And so that is difficult. But one of the ways you do it is you find common ground. And so one of the first places I go when I want to find a Republican to work on a bill with is to the community of veterans. Because at least we have that common experience and hopefully some shared values from that common experience that can serve us well. It's one of the reasons why I've worked very hard through an organization I started called Serve America to get more veterans into Congress. And by the way, not just military veterans, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, CIA veterans, people who have just had to make some sacrifice in their personal lives to serve the country, to serve something bigger than themselves. Because if they can bring some of that service ethic to Congress, then maybe we can get over some of the bitter partisanship that so often keeps people in their corners and therefore makes them ineffective.
And it seems to me like, just listening to you, that you're the kind of person when you encounter someone who disagrees with you, it makes you, rather than makes you feeling self-righteous, it makes you feel curious, and you want to know about how they think and what they think, and
well, I like to think so. I mean, it's a little hard in this environment not to feel self-righteous sometimes, so I identify with that. But yes, at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do for the country. And look, that was my job in the Marines. My platoon of largely 18-year-olds, but a few in their early 20s and mid-20s as well, came from all over the country. Different backgrounds, different religious beliefs, different political beliefs. Some from very wealthy communities, some from very poor communities. But at the end of the day, we were able to set aside those differences to do what's right for America. And to do that in an environment where a lot of people were trying to kill us every day. So if we could figure out how to do that in Iraq, I think that those of us in Congress owe it to great Americans like our troops to be able to figure it out there. Because we come from 435 different districts around the country, 50 different states. But at the end of the day, we ought to do the same thing. We ought to be able to put aside our differences to do what's right for America. And I'll tell you one other thing, is that having been in Iraq also gives me a little bit of perspective, that as bad as things are in Washington, it could be worse. It definitely could be worse. And that's why, one of the things I love to advise, young people coming out of college is, yes, consider serving. Consider also just doing something hard. Go get your hands dirty. Go do something that's risky, that may not be where you're going to see your career go or where you're going to, make your money or build your family someday, but just go do something that's a little challenging, that's a little risky. You might learn a lot, and I think it will help give you some perspective later on in life.
Congressman, thank you. Thank you so much.